the CEO of JPMorgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, he went ahead and gave his initial take on the potential acquisition of Capital One acquiring Discover. We did a video about this a couple of days ago. We talked about the possible ramifications, how this might impact the industry. I thought this video was very interesting, so I want to go ahead and play his initial reaction first. Let's go ahead and play this, and I'm going to give you my thoughts right after.
Last week, we saw a major deal with Capital One and its deal to acquire Discover. The potential there is to reshape the credit card industry. The combination would create the largest card issuer in the U.S., surpassing JPMorgan Chase.
For now.
As measured for now. So if this deal is approved, does it create more competition for you?
I think companies should be allowed to do and innovate and grow and merge and try to challenge things. I think that's good. So I think it's a mistake to act like it's bad. It's good for competition. In fact, I think they should allow some of these smaller banks to merge. If that's how they think they can best compete with JPMorgan, you should let them. It may not work in every case, but you shouldn't predetermine that. You should let the market predetermine that. In this particular thing, there's the credit card business, which is they'll be bigger, more scale. They're very good at it. I mean, I have enormous respect for Richard Fairbanks and Cap One. And then there's the networks. There's the debit network and the credit network. The debit network, it may have an unfair advantage versus us. Of course I have a problem with that. You know, like, why should they be allowed to price debit different than we price debit just because of a law that was passed? I don't know what their plans are, really. You know, like I said, I have whatever Richard does, I pay a lot of attention to do. Can they actually create another credit card network? I don't know. But, you know, my view is let them compete. Let them try. And if we think it's unfair, we'll complain about that. But I'm not worried about it, really. But we do track everything he does.
All right, so that's the comments from the CEO of JPMorgan Chase, Jamie Dimon. He says, let them compete. Let the free market dictate who can do what. Couple of things that I thought were interesting, right? So he's initially asked about the acquisition. She lets him know that, hey, JPMorgan is going to be surpassed as the #1 credit card and loan volume in the US. And he says, for now, right, with a smirk, because we know if this Capital One acquisition goes through, JPMorgan is no longer going to be #1 in credit card loan volume. The second thing that I thought was interesting was he gives a lot of credit to Richard Fairbanks, the CEO of Capital One. If you're not too familiar with Capital One and their CEO, Richard Fairbanks and Capital One, they were among the first credit card companies to really embrace the technology age, embracing things like analytics to determine who's going to receive, certain credit card offers, online banking, and risk prevention in the online space. I give them a lot of credit for that. So it's dope to see JPMorgan Chase CEO also give him that credit. So now the third thing that I noticed was, why is he saying that Capital One is going to have an unfair advantage over JPMorgan when it comes to debit transactions? Let's look at that. So the law that he's talking about is the Durbin Amendment. If you go and you get some coffee in the morning and you take your JPMorgan Chase Visa card and you swipe to buy your morning coffee for $5, the entire $5 is not going to go to the coffee shop. There's going to be a small percentage that goes back to JPMorgan as a fee for allowing the coffee shop to be able to accept debit cards, right? So every time you take your debit card, swipe, 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 JPMorgan, Wells Fargo, they get a cut of that action, a small percentage. The whole point of this was if they could pass an amendment, which they did, which caps how much JPMorgan and these big banks would get, more money would be kept in the pockets of the entrepreneurs and the mom and pop store owners. And hopefully those savings would basically trickle down to the customer in savings. So ideally, this is how it would have helped everybody. In reality, it's a lot more convoluted. It's not as straightforward. Matter of fact, some banks even created new fees in order to offset the money that they were losing because of the Durbin Act. It's a mess, but that's really the whole point, right? Let's talk about how Capital One is going to kind of circumvent this Durbin Amendment. This is the loophole, and this is what the CEO of JPMorgan Chase is saying. Hold on, time out. This is going to give an unfair advantage to Capital One / Discover if in fact this deal goes through. What is this loophole? What they had in mind and who they had in mind for the Durbin Amendment wasn't Discover and American Express, because technically speaking, they looked at Discover and American Express more so as payment networks. They're kind of in a different status, different category than your JPMorgan Chase your Wells Fargo, your Citibank, they're kind of separate. So because Discover and American Express don't fall under the same classification as a JPMorgan Chase, certain regulations don't really apply to them. But if Capital One goes ahead and buys Discover, right, we now have the Discover network now under the umbrella of Capital One. And we just talked about before at the top of this video, Capital One with Discover is going to be number one when it comes to credit card loan volume. Number one. Now remember, Discover is already pretty much grandfathered in so that the Durbin Amendment doesn't impact them. So once Capital One absorbs them and takes them over, Capital One is now going to have their own payment network where there's not going to be a law which determines how much they can charge on certain debit transactions. So for example, in the future, hypothetically, right, in the future, if somebody has a JPMorgan Chase debit card and goes to the store and buys the $5 coffee, remember the Durbin Amendment is going to say, wait, JPMorgan, you're a big traditional bank. You have over 10 billion in asset holdings. In this example, you can only take 30 cents from this $5 transaction. I'm just making a number up. And then somebody else comes after with their Capital One Discover debit card and they swipe. Discover and Capital One might just say, you know what, I don't want to take just 30 cents like JPMorgan is forced to take. Maybe I want to take 35 cents or 40 cents. Now, just like that, Capital One is able to start making more money on debit transactions than JPMorgan. So again, they're going to have the lead when it comes to number one in credit card loan volume. And then they're going to have the advantage when it comes to debit card transactions. And I'm going to put on the screen how much money there is when it comes to debit card transactions every single year in the US. That's a lot of money. The point is, on the chessboard, Capital One and Discover, they're able to make more moves when it comes to debit card transactions than the other credit card issuers like your JPMorgan, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. This is why I said this deal can make them a legit competitor to not only Amex, because Amex business model is also very similar, credit card issuer. They have more control in the fees that they can charge, and a lot of those fees that they charge merchants, they go ahead and they roll that back into the rewards programs and the points for their consumers. This is why the CEO of JPMorgan Chase is saying
the debit network and the credit network, the debit network, it may have an unfair advantage versus us. Of course I have a problem with that. You know, like, why should they be allowed to price debit different than we price debit just because of a law that was passed?
And we got to just wait and see how this is going to turn out. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. Hopefully you understand the concepts behind what's going on in this acquisition. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead, like and subscribe. Go down in the comments and type something because it helps me in the algorithm. And I'm going to check you guys out in the next video. Have a good one. Peace.